morning everyone and welcome to Aussie's webinar. Today is the first webinar in the Governance Toolbox series titled Working with Your Board. My name is Vesna, I'm an employee of Redback Conferencing and I'll be a facilitator for today's session. I will now hand it over to Kate Ellis from Diligent, who will introduce today's presenter and we can all get started.
Thanks Vesna. Welcome to Diligent's first webinar with the Australasian Society of Association Executives, a part of an ongoing series this year. I'll be your joint host today. Just a little bit about me. I'm the marketing manager here at Diligent. Just a little bit about Diligent in case other people are wondering who we are. We were founded in 2001 and we provide governance software for boards and leadership teams globally. We currently have over 140,000 users worldwide. So to kick off the series, we've created material to help you navigate the complexities of governance within your association. Now our host today is Damien Mitch. He's currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Australasian Podiatry Council. He's also the Director of the Australasian Society of Association Executives. He's the Chair of the National Primary Healthcare Partnership and a Director of Allied Health Professions Australia. He's a Senior Lecturer at the Clinical Leadership of Management at the Monash University, and until recently he's also a member on the Board of Directors of Austin Health. Very busy guy at the moment. He's been involved in governance health for many years, working in associations, public and private sector health organisations, and he runs his own aged care and software business. He also holds an MBA and is a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Today, he's talking about governance from the CEO's perspective. Now, before I just hand you over to Damien, I'll just cover off how the webinar will run today. We'll be running for a total of 60 minutes, which consists of a 45-minute presentation with survey questions throughout and Q&A at the end, which you can ask through the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. Now I'd like to hand you over to Damien.
Good morning, everyone. Look, I just thought I'd get kicked off with a really quick description of what governance is, and this is from the ASX, so didn't invent this one myself. Just to make it really clear about what it is that I mean when I talk about governance. So the framework of rules, relationships, systems and processes within and by which authority is exercised and controlled in corporations. I'll come back to that again shortly because it's a really important description of what governance is, and it's unfortunately one of the things that I think is often misunderstood, and that creates all sorts of problems for boards and particularly for CEOs who are trying to work with volunteer boards often, and wondering why it is that they can't quite get the results that they're after. So we'll just do a very quick poll, which you can see in front of you. Just wondering what your board seems to think their primary role is. So if I can get people to very quickly jump in and throw a response into that poll. Very quickly, it's emerging that decision-making, monitoring and adjusting strategy, supervising the CEO seem to be the key ones there. While that's going, I'll jump on to the next slide. Look, this is an area that I jump on pretty quickly around boards and the way that they make decisions and how they exercise authority and control. One of the things that I would say is that one of the functions of boards is to make decisions. There's no question about that. However, making decisions isn't the only job of the board, and making decisions isn't the whole job of the board. To explain what I mean, essentially a board of directors can make any decision that they want about anything in the organisation. So they could decide what toilet paper is going to go into the toilets on any given day. However, if a board was making that type of decision, on any measure, you'd look at them and say, well, you're not governing. So how is it that we start to separate what is it that is governing and what is it that is decision-making, and ensure that the right types of decisions are being made at the right levels of authority and control. Well, here's me hitting the down button to get the next slide. So decision-making is not necessarily governance in itself, and that slide's a bit confusing because performance, delegation, monitoring, understanding and adjusting are all parts of the role of governance. But they sit quite separately to decision-making in itself. And when you come back to governance is the framework of rules, relationships, systems, processes within and by which authority is exercised and controlled in corporations. You start to think about that relationship with decision making. You start to come back to what I call the tools of governance. Decision making is just one. The tools of governance also include what are your strategies, what are your policies, how do you manage risk, and what tools do you use to manage risk, and compliance. And if your board is using just decision making broadly and their decision making power to guide and direct the organisation, and they're not thinking sensibly about how those decisions should be made and using what tools, then chances are you've just got a board that makes decisions randomly. And I've seen it at quite a number of times, even in very good boards with very good governance systems, where a director will pop a question on the table and the board will make a decision that drops straight into management, often unintentionally. But if you're sitting on the other end of that, it can get very, very frustrating and difficult for CEOs to manage because of the power relationship of a board versus CEO. So probably my first tip in terms of managing governance from a CEO or management perspective is to start to focus on the tools of governance and to say to the board, which of the strategies do you want to change when you're making this decision? Which one isn't quite right, such that you feel that you need to make a decision in this area? And what strategy are we going to adjust? What policy, if it's not that, what policy are we looking to adjust? And if it's not that, what part of our risk framework do we want to adjust? And if it's not that, what part of our compliance framework do we want to adjust? If it's not one of those things, you wouldn't change a strategy or a policy or a risk or a compliance measure around toilet paper. It'd be nonsensical. As you come up in the level of decision making, you can still apply the same type of rationale. And if boards aren't adjusting a strategy, not adjusting a policy, not adjusting risk or compliance, then the reality is they're probably in the management domain. So to get into how do you manage this stuff, probably my first rule for boards is that authority and accountability must stay together. If you look at all of the research around decision making, it points to the fact that if you separate authority and accountability, you're in trouble. My example that I see often in associations around this one is conferences, where the board will say, well, the conference is really important and it carries a risk because we rely on it, and therefore we're going to appoint a committee that reports to the board to run the conference. Who's then accountable for the budget and the outcome? The CEO. Automatically, the second they've done that, they've separated the authority, because the board has a committee that reports to it, who will make decisions, and they have the authority, the implicit authority from the board to make those decisions, and the CEO being accountable for the outcome. We then wonder why it is that those committees get frustrated because they get obstruction from a CEO, what they perceive to be obstruction from the CEO around areas of management control. And the CEO gets frustrated because they're constantly trying to rein in a committee that's not accountable for the outcomes. And I've actually had somebody say to me at one point, you have to understand this is my reputation on the line. And I had to say to the person, yes, and this is my job on the line. So let's sit down and get this together. I'd argue that if you're going to make a CEO accountable, you've got to give them the authority. Doesn't mean that you don't need the expertise to be inputting into the management function. You often need the experts to tell you what type of educational content, but you've got to keep that authority together. Next one's be competent. Nothing will destroy a relationship between a CEO and a board quicker than a CEO who doesn't say what they're going to do and do what they're going to say. Be accountable, and this one's a bit. It's less simple than it looks on the slide. If CEOs constantly come out saying that was a decision of the board, or they constantly keep getting decisions from the board to reinforce what should be management decisions, and that they should be standing up and saying, I made this decision because it was delegated to me as part of my delegations. It was my responsibility. I assessed the various impacts and risks, and I made a decision to do this thing. If the response from senior management is to then say, well, it was a decision of the board, you can't then sit back and wonder why it is that people turn up in your office saying, I want to present to the board on this. And often the conversation is, well, that's a management issue. Well, no, I know that the board makes all the important decisions because you keep telling me that the board made that decision that I didn't like, and therefore I've got to get in front of the board. So be accountable in that context means that if management has to make a decision and it's within their delegations, you can seek advice from the board, and I'll get to that in a minute, but you've got to own those decisions and be prepared to stand up and defend them. If you can't defend the decision, you probably should have gone about making it differently. The role of committees, I'm absolutely rigid on saying that there are governance committees. So the Finance, Audit and Risk, Noms Committee, Nominations Committee are all governance committees. They're committees that are formed to assist the board with their governance function. They're not committees that are there for operational purposes. And I put conference committees in an operational committee capacity. Operational committees have to report through your CEO, otherwise you split that authority and accountability. Governance committees shouldn't be considering anything that's not related to those governance tools. And if you can keep those lines really clear, then you start to head in the right direction. I tend to have a rule that I don't want anyone who's situated in the governance layer sitting on operational committees, because it confuses things. And the example I roll out is that I did have at one point a board member who sat on a conference committee who then wanted to have a conversation with the board about whether dinner should be 2 courses or 3, and had to kill that off very quickly. The best way is to keep them separated. If you can't, then you need to be really, really clear with directors when they're performing an operational role, and that operational role reports through the management layer, and when they're governing. And you've got to be really brutal about saying this operational thing is not governance and doesn't belong in the boardroom. Some people will cope with that. Some directors really struggle. So we've got another poll here. As CEO, I believe my role in board elections is primarily, before we move on, we'll give you a couple of seconds to fill that one out. This is a really tricky role and one that can have a profound impact. Interesting. Okay, so most people are saying that they're an administrator, a returning officer, less a headhunter, which is interesting, and almost nobody is an election manager, which I'll address in a second, because this is an area I think we as executives have a bigger role to play. So moving right along, guiding elections. Let me be really clear. If you get bad directors, you will struggle to work with your board no matter what, because bad directors can destroy you and make your job hell and terrible and woeful to do. A few things I'd say. One, elections are constitutionally bound. You can't play with the Constitution. You have to work with the Constitution you've got. You should start thinking about a nominations committee, though. And if you can get a nominations committee together of good, rational, sensible people, you can start to make sure that the people who come onto the board are well-skilled and the right people to get onto a board. Now, I'll be really clear here about one key thing. It's not for management to play in the political layer. I did get asked recently who I thought would make a good director on a board, and I said, oh well, that's not a matter for me to have a comment on, and I was pushed fairly firmly to name some names, and I was very clear about saying any CEO who gets into the politics of who sits on boards is going to not survive as a CEO for very long. You have to be entirely agnostic about the people who come on, because that's not your choice. And if you get into the politics, you become politicised, and once you're politicised, it's game over. As a CEO, you'll find it really hard to operate. So having a nominations committee allows you to sidestep that, but you've got a really big role to play in process to make sure that the directors that end up on the board are the right ones. There's a few steps in that process. One, if your membership are your electors, because that's sometimes not the case, but if your membership are the electors, you've got to educate them on what the function of governance is. And I keep saying to people, governance is actually boring. It's not exciting like running a conference. It's a pretty boring gig if done well and if done properly. So you've got to outline the job of governance, and you've got to give that both to the membership and to the people who think they would like to apply or put their hand up. If your nominees don't understand the job of governance, then the wrong people will put their hand up because they'll misunderstand it. And then when they get there, they will come to the table with the wrong impression of what they're there to do. So the first thing I'd say is if you're running elections, make sure that your briefing to potential candidates is really clear about what the job is and what it's not. Outline the skills required. In my case, there's no point having a fantastic health practitioner who is the best clinician in the world but has no governance skills putting their hand up to come onto a board. It's counterproductive, and it leaves them sitting there unskilled, and the default position for them to move to is where are they comfortable, and often they'll be comfortable with what I'd call volunteering and committee work. Get your forms, get your application and nomination forms laid out in such a way that you force the applicants to address the skills, not just their professional or industry experience. Again, some people present fantastic CVs, but when you force them to address the skills of governance, they fall very, very short. And that starts to outline the case that they might not be ready for that job. Get them to address conflicts of interest. quite specifically, because in an election process, it's much more difficult to manage conflicts of interest, because if they're elected by the members, God help you if you try and take them out of anything because of conflict of interest. The worst thing you can do is leave unidentified conflicts of interest sitting there. The last is a step that I'd encourage boards to think about, and I do encourage people to think about, is to include the capacity for your noms committee to review and for the company secretary to correct information, like an undisclosed conflict of interest. Because I've seen far too many elections where absolute misinformation and misstatements are made. Some of the best ones are where nominees openly say that they will seek to break the laws around collective bargaining. You know, if I'm elected, I will make sure that we negotiate and boycott this particular supplier. That sort of stuff needs to be called out, because uninformed electors will put people on boards based on misinformation if you let it get through. Now this is all management driven. Okay, your boards aren't going to come up with this stuff on their own. They will need you to help them get there. Induction. Again, many association boards and directors don't understand the purpose of governance. That idea that it's not a committee. The job of governance, quite separate to the purpose. You've got to have some really clear statements around what the job is. And the third area where they tend to fall flat is a clear understanding of fiduciary duty. And that comes into play where you've got conflict of interest particularly. And there's a lot of conflict of interest in associations. I did an article recently about competing against members in core business. When members start running CPD type organisations and then want to get themselves onto the board because it helps them to run their own business, that sort of stuff needs to be dealt with very, very quickly. If you've got a director coming in and they haven't had a really solid induction, run both jointly by management and by the chair, or get someone external to do it if you don't have the skills in-house. Any director who goes into a boardroom without getting a good induction is going to be a nightmare in my view. The various players in induction. So you've got the board. You've got to explain the role of the board and the mechanism for it to make collective decisions. The best and the worst of directors comes out when they think that they can call the office and individually direct. We know they can't, but they often don't realise that. I've had staff grilled on what their CVs were and why they were appointed by individuals in the past, and that sort of stuff has to be stomped on very, very quickly. The role of governance committees, separate to operational committees, you'll see there the role of individual directors, the role of the president, which I'll come to in a minute, the role of management, and the role of operational committees. If you've not covered all of those things in induction, then you're leading someone to misunderstand the differences between them all, and it'll be very difficult for them to operate. So we'll go into another poll really quickly. This one is about the role of president, and the role of president is fairly crucial to a CEO. Get a bad president and you've got a problem. Okay, well that's good. There's plenty of people saying chairing the board. A few people saying supervising the CEO, which we'll get to in a second. The primary executive worries me. Any organisation that has an executive chair and a CEO, I think, has real challenges. So we'll move on to the next slide and we'll get into talking about the chair. Look, I can't reinforce this top point strongly enough. Don't play politics. Okay, who the chair is not your concern. Who the directors aren't your concern. And any time you get into playing in that politics layer, you'll be in trouble. Which means that if you start backing one person as chair over another, then you're going to come unstuck at some point. Don't set yourself up to have an aggressive chair as they step into the role. Again, be accountable. The third point is a bit of advice that I give to people. When your boards make decisions that frustrate you, and when your chair makes decisions that frustrate you, the first thing you should be saying to them is, look, I have a strong view on this, but I also have a vested view. Don't believe me, get advice. I've used it successfully year in, year out, where, and a great example was when a board sat down to work out some KPIs for me at one point, and they walked out of the room and said, look, we're going to use a 360-degree process to set your KPIs. And I kind of said to them, do you understand what you're doing with that? And I was pretty blunt about saying not happy about that as a concept. And they said, what, so you have a problem with a 360-degree process, do you? And I had to point out that no, I didn't have a problem with a 360-degree process, except for the fact that it's not used in setting KPIs. And I've not seen that done, A, and B, I can't imagine it'll be successful. Rather than me going in there and fighting the board to say this is dumb, I simply said to them, please find somebody who understands the setting of KPIs and ask their advice. And of course, within a week they'd come back to me and said, we need to cascade your KPIs out of the strat plan. Hallelujah, I didn't have to tell them that. And I didn't have to fight the board on their decision, because that would have simply set me up against the board. Some tools there that I'd throw in around managing expectations of the board. Look, I use my board in an advisory capacity regularly. Okay, and I think any CEO who doesn't is not using that as a resource terribly well. But you've got to be really clear about when you're asking the board to advise you in a decision that you need to make within your delegations. And I've had many a conversation with chairs and boards where I've said, look, I appreciate that you're getting into board decision-making mode, because that's what boards will often do. However, I'm asking your advice. It's not your decision. If, when you ask advice, you allow the board to make the decision for you, and it's a management decision that you should have made under delegation, you're in for a world of pain down the track. You really have to push back on boards and say, look, on this one, I'm going to ask your advice because I'm interested in it, and I want to think about it as part of the decision-making process. But under the delegations, this is my decision to make. You might be happy with the decision, you might not be happy with the decision. We can talk about that as a separate issue, but because I'm happy to be accountable for the decision, but it's mine to make. And if you can get into that rhythm of having a board member that, a board that is really clear on when they're offering advice and when they're making decisions, it helps you to stay in that management domain and them in the board domain. Having an annual plan that cascades out of your strategic plan, commit to things, and by the end of the year, show them that you can tick them off, is critically important around trust and faith. If they don't believe you can perform, then they won't trust you. and if they don't trust you, then you're always going to have problems. Then get on and deliver it despite the distractions. And it doesn't mean that everything has to be completed on every plan, but if you're not going to complete something, start to explain why during the year, so it doesn't come as a surprise. Use performance indicators, budgets, this stuff is all pretty straightforward. You should know all of this stuff. Use your delegations, but make sure there's no surprises. It's okay for management to make decisions, but boards should never be surprised. They hate surprises. Focus on deliverables as much as possible. You don't want to be focused on the fluffy stuff of associations, who's happy, who's not, etc. You've got to be able to say, well, during the course of the year, we promised to deliver these things, and we did. Use your CEO report. Your CEO report is probably your primary communication tool with your board, because it allows you to build a story over time. It doesn't need to be a never-ending document of many, many pages, but it does need to be really clear about giving the board a sense of what's going on and a sense of what's coming over the horizon. Okay, so this is a chart that I've drawn to try and help explain to people the relationship between a board, a chair, and or a president and a CEO, because it's one of the most misunderstood relationships that I see in associations, which is odd because it's not misunderstood in anywhere near as much in corporate Australia. You'll see the board at the top, and we know that ultimately the board acts as a collective, not as a group of individuals. So unless a decision is made by the board, it doesn't carry the force of the board. And any director who wants to come to you and say, well, I want, you simply say, well, that's great, take that to the board. And then, by the way, we're going to talk about the various tools of governance. The board delegates responsibility and accountability to two people, usually. Well, sets of people, but two important ones in this context. You've got the president. Now, the president is a delegated role. It's not a directing role. It's a delegated role. So the board authorise the president to do certain things, not the other way around. They usually authorise the president to run the board meetings. They usually authorise the president to be the interface between the CEO and the board. And sometimes they'll have authorisation, delegated responsibility around being the spokesperson for the organisation. Equally, the board delegate to the CEO. And importantly, that's a board delegation to the CEO, not a board delegation to the president to the CEO, which confuses some people because, and I've had interesting conversations with CEOs who have said, no, I report to the president. And when you've tried to talk this through, they're absolutely adamant that they report to the president, not to the board, which sets up a really difficult relationship, particularly if you don't get a great president. By making it really clear that you've got a full delegation from the whole of the board to operate, that then allows your president or manages your president in such a way that they understand that if you have a disagreement with the president, that's a matter for the board to resolve, not a matter for the president to simply say, well, you will do as I tell you to, because the CEO role actually has some autonomy in a best practice governance model. There is an accountability interface between the two. That's because the board can't be talking to the CEO as regularly as a president. And when it drops down beyond that, you've got the president's role is primarily to deal with those tools of governance and to be a figurehead for the organisation. However, the CEO still has a role in executive leadership and has the purview of the management tools. So management tools being internal policies, the budgets and all of the various tools that you would expect a CEO to be using to run an organisation. Those don't belong to the President. The President shouldn't be sitting in performance reviews. The President shouldn't be sitting in internal budget discussions. Those are not the tools of governance. Equally, the CEO, and this is a mistake that I see CEOs make, the CEO shouldn't be tinkering with strategy, risk, and those matters that belong to the board. And you interface with the external environment, and both the CEO and the President will interface with the external environment on behalf of the board of the organisation. Feel free to throw in, to type in questions if you've got them. So, working with the board you've got, my advice here is talk about governance. Make sure it's on the agenda. Have tough conversations. You're the CEO. If you can't go to your board and say, this is what I need from you so that I can run a high-performing team, then you've got a problem. You need to step up to the plate. And you need to be pretty honest about that. Walking out of boardrooms with wishy-washy, undefined decisions that leave you wondering whether you've got the authority to do things or not, wondering what the intention of the board was or wasn't. It just makes it very, very difficult to operate, and you can't manage a high-performing team if you can't get clear decisions out of a board. Now, there's a question here, what do you do when the board refuses to allow you into the board meetings? See that last point? Know when to cut and run. Look, if the board is refusing to let you into board meetings, then I would say there is a fundamental breakdown in trust and or a fundamental lack of understanding of what the role of a board and a CEO is. If you can't, and the role of a CEO in a board meeting is as an advisor. So quite frankly, any board that doesn't want you in the boardroom clearly doesn't value your advice. But ultimately, you're not there to try and influence the board in one way or another. You're there to present the facts, present the information, present the risks, and then allow the board to weigh those things up and make a decision. And one of the worst things you can do as CEO is to go and try to pitch an outcome because that's what you want, as opposed to going in and providing the information and the risks and allowing the board to talk them through. The other worst thing you can do is not accepting that a board will often make decisions that you would have made differently, and as long as they've done so, understanding the risks and having the right information, then as a CEO you're not there to undermine that or not support it. You're there to walk out of that room and say to your team, right, guys, we've got a job to do. I think I'd be saying to a board, either I'm in the room or I think we probably need to find a new CEO. So that's getting back down to that building trust. Now there's some other questions that I'll try and cover off quickly in this area. How best to handle an individual nuisance director? Wonderful. I have a saying, and I will openly say I stole it from a guy called Ian Mayer, who was head of marketing for CPA Australia for many years, where it simply goes to the president, you run the board, I run the business. Really simple. If you have a rogue director that is, dear president, if you have a rogue director that is impacting on my ability to operate as a CEO, then you need to sort that out because it's your board to run. The board has delegated that responsibility to you, and you need to step up and do it. And if that's not happening, then you need to start to talk to other directors about saying, okay, well, somebody's got to run the board, somebody's got to run these behaviours. They should come out in the annual review, which we'll talk about in a minute. But you've got to push that back on the President, because if you try and do it, you will come off as trying to interfere with the board. If your President's not capable, then you probably want to have that conversation. I can honestly say I did make a President cry once, because of the fact that I was frustrated with the fact that they weren't managing their board, and that was having a profound impact on our ability to perform. What should you do if the tradition has been that the CEO reports directly to the chair? Simply go back to best practice governance, and start to point out that the President is a delegated position, as is the CEO, and they're delegated with equal veracity. Start to document those delegations and go back to the board and say, okay, well, this is how this needs to work, because ultimately as CEO, I'm accountable to you collectively, not as individuals. The President is accountable individually, not as a delegated role. And any decision that the President makes, unless you're clear about those delegations, if a President is making a decision that impacts on management, they've crossed into the wrong space. So I'd be starting to have that conversation fairly quickly. Moving right along on questions, some boards look very much to the CEO for leadership and advice. Is that wrong? Absolutely. The CEO is there to provide executive leadership, run the business, and that is a leadership role. But your role as CEO is to lead in the context of a strategic plan and a set of policies provided by the board. Now, you can go back to the board and say, look, here is my view, but that's your domain. You need to get your head around this, guys. And I push back on boards pretty firmly to say there are some things that are your job, not mine, and that there's a leadership piece in that you guys have to step up and take. If you start running the board, then you're in trouble. I've just had some advice that we should leave some of the Q&A for the end as well, because we're just about getting to the point that we should be moving on. So I'll scoot through the rest of this reasonably quickly. Couple of things. Recognise the cost of transparency and inaction. Transparency comes at a cost. Okay, and I've done a bit of research to try and work out whether there's an optimal level of transparency, and there is. And that optimal level of transparency is the maximum you can provide at a reasonable cost that doesn't generate additional unnecessary costs through a level of intrusiveness that is difficult to manage. So you've got to find the right level of transparency. So how much information you give to the board, it shouldn't be everything, it shouldn't be nothing, it should be enough to allow the board to be comfortable. Now, any board has a right to look at financial information. They don't have directors don't actually have a carte blanche right to trawl through organisations. They can only ask for information that's related to their proper purpose in terms of governing. Talk priorities, not lists. I keep pushing back on people and saying, tell me your top 3 priorities. Don't give me the 30 things that you want done. We'll focus on the top 3. And when one gets done, we'll add one. Associations will kill you otherwise. Talk risk. Know the language of risk. Understand that there's an Australian standard on risk management, and understand that it's okay to take risk. So it's important for the CEO to be able to talk in that language, because if you can't, the board won't. educate. Often I encourage people to send off articles to the whole board on a fairly regular basis on good governance. Particularly, I've got a great one on why boards micromanage that says that it's all about them, not you. Make the president accountable. The president has to run the board. Full stop. Wear your big boy girl pants. You can't be a wallflower in this game. You've got to be prepared to speak up and know when to cut and run. If you've just got a dysfunctional board and you can't get along with them, time to move on. Engagement, moving right along. Nearly 70% of CEOs spend more than 10 hours a month on board work. Often it's more than 20. About 30% of the time it's less than 10. That you've got to recognise that that's work, and you've got to do it. You can't ignore your board. You've got to be talking to them. You've also got to be talking to individual directors, and often it doesn't need to be about much. You can't divide and conquer, and I'm not suggesting that you try and divide and conquer or any of that sort of stuff, but often it's just about touching base and saying to people, look, that thing that you're interested in, well, there's an update on it. No surprises ever. Don't ever surprise your board. Get advice from your board regularly, because that way they know that you are making decisions and that you are interested in what they have to say. Do go to dinners and functions. A bright person once said to me that half the meeting occurs at the dinner before, and if you're not there, they'll either talk with you if you're there, or they'll talk about you if you're not. Work with the chair. Focus on the job of governance. This is around board evaluation. You have to put board evaluation on the table. Chances are, if it's not there and it's not part of their annual cycle, they won't do it. You're going to have to keep raising the idea of the board should be evaluating its own performance against the job of governance. So not did we all get along and do we think we're wonderful people, but did we actually achieve the job of governance? How do we know? Try to get the board to assess their contribution to value relative to their cost. Tell them how much it costs to run board meetings every year, both your time, staff time, and the actual costs in flying people around if you do that. Because board meetings aren't free. And, yes, we need them, but there's a cost, and you should be entitled as an organisation to extract an equivalent value out of that board by allowing them to make good governance decisions. Do have tough conversations with them. If you're afraid of your board, then you need to deal with that. Last poll, or actually second last poll I think it is. Or not? There it is. How are your documents currently distributed? PDF documents by email. Yeah, that pretty much answers that question. Oh, by courier. That's impressive. I can't imagine printing board papers these days. I just refuse to do it. Okay, well, it looks like most people are emailing, which does raise some security issues, particularly if there's sensitive information in it. No surprises that there are board portals, and 15% of people are using that by the look of it. So we'll move right along now to questions.
Thanks, Damien. We've got a number of questions already appearing in the chat box, so we'll just hold for a couple of minutes or less, and we'll run through them. So just bear with me. So Robert is asking, some boards look very much the CEO for leadership advice. Is that wrong?
Yeah. Look, I was covering this a little bit earlier, but look, there's executive leadership, and CEOs need to lead. Okay, you've got a team in many cases, and your role as a CEO is to be a leader in the organisation. But equally, the board of directors needs to inform themselves on where the industry's going, where the organisation's going, and they need to demonstrate some leadership as well. If you've got a passive board that isn't interested in doing the work of creating strategy, being involved in strategy, and they're just ticking boxes and looking to the CEO to do everything, then chances are you've probably got the wrong board, is my view.
Thanks, Damien. Next question. I'm being asked to be company secretary and CEO. Any problems with the COE?
I'm assuming that was meant to be CEO.
CEO, sorry. Yes.
Look, in an ideal world, and this is best practice governance, your company secretary would be an independent player who reports directly to the board and who isn't in any way tied into the operational structures of the organisation. Lots of big companies have a company secretary employed directly by the board. That's never going to happen in most associations, so everything from there back is a compromise. If you've got somebody who runs, say, corporate services or one of those types of functions, they will often make good company secretaries. If you're not big enough to have somebody with a bit of grunt who does that, then you're pretty much left with either a volunteer or your CEO. And if you're left with a choice between a volunteer or the CEO, I would go with the CEO any day of the week, because being a company secretary these days is not a simple role, and if you bugger it up, quite frankly, you can leave your directors exposed. So my preference would be that it's the CEO over and above a volunteer. Look, is it ideal? No. Would you prefer it that way to having volunteers? Absolutely.
Thanks, Damien. Rich is asking, should the board have approval authority over the CEO's business plan?
Look, that's a tricky one, and I'll deal with it in a slightly pragmatic way. If your business plan has been created in such a way that the board isn't happy with it, then you've got a fundamental problem, because you're heading in a direction that isn't consistent with where your board wants you to go, which leaves you a real problem. Should a business plan require approval? Look, probably not. I put mine up for the board to approve, simply because of the fact that that I have this view that that they need to be engaged and involved in the operations. They need to understand the operations of the organisation. However, I don't let them play with it. So if you don't like it, give me some advice on what you don't like, and I will go away and work with the team to think about those things, and I'll let you know what we're doing. But it's a bit of a fine line, that one.
Okay, Julie's asking, is it okay for the President to directly approach individual operational leaders regarding the CEO's performance?
Not without a formal process. Look, I'm pretty strict on this. Staff report to me, full stop, end of story. And God help anyone who starts to play with that. And I'm very brutal in induction around saying to people, if you start messing with the staff, you will have me to deal with, and I won't be nice about it. In the event that you've got a situation where a board, not just a president, a board has reasons to want to question the performance of a CEO, particularly around things like leadership and culture, then I'm fine with a board that wants to use a 360 type process and wants to involve senior staff members. But, and again, this comes back to that go and get advice. That shouldn't be taken lightly, and it's not for somebody who's not expert to do. A 360 should be run independently. So ideally a consultant will collect all of the information, will collate it, and then provide it to the CEO and the President to assist with performance management. In my view, it's inappropriate for a President to do this. I'll just call up and speak to the staff. The overlaying, there is a complicating factor in what you do with whistleblowers, and I put a very open invitation on the table that if our staff feel that there is something fundamentally wrong in the organisation that is putting the organisation at risk, then they're welcome to go and whistleblow, and there'll be no ramifications in the organisation. I'd like to think, and we've had this conversation, I'd like to think that I've earned enough respect for people to come and raise it with me first, but if they don't feel it's being addressed and it puts the organisation at risk, then whistleblowing needs to occur. Equally, that's not just an opportunity to go to the President every time I make a decision that you don't like, because that'll end badly very, very quickly. So it's a bit of a fine line, that one.
Thanks, Damien. We've only got 2 minutes left. We might have to just have one more question, and then any other questions that we don't get to, we will respond to you directly. Larry is asking, we have not had elections for the board for years, and it's normally self-managed with the CEO's assistants, so that nominees match vacancies. I'm attracted to nominations committee process, but it might open up the board membership process to a politicised one. How do you deal with the fractions on the board?
The quickest way to get rid of factions is to go back to focusing on the job. Look, I'm a big fan of having more talent available than there are seats, and I think if you've not developed that talent pipeline, you've potentially failed. Yeah, I know it depends. Look, it depends on how many people you're talking about. If you've got a huge membership and you don't have enough talent lining up to try and get on to the board, then I'd be very surprised if you've only got 5 members and you can't always fill a position. Then it's a different proposition. But a good board is a board where people understand what they've got to do, what the job is. They're building skills, or they've built skills, and they want to contribute. Now, if that means that there's, call it politicisation, then I still think that the outcome is better than the risk, because you can often find that you get some really great people coming out. Because you've got to offset that against the idea that the board is a closed shop, it's jobs for the boys, the only person who gets appointed is the person they've tapped on the shoulder. That, to me, causes much worse problems.
Thanks, Damien. We've now approached 12 noon, so we might have to finish there. I'd like to obviously thank Damien for his contributions today. Great webinar. You've also seen on the screen there is a survey. If you could give us some feedback in reference to the content and able to answer all the questions, that would be great. And also, if you'd like a copy of the presentation recording and any information from Diligent, please do let us know so we can come back to you. And as mentioned before, all the questions that we were unable to answer, we will come back to you directly via email. Thanks, Damien.
No worries. Thanks, everyone, for coming.